Jimmy Butler started his career with the Chicago Bulls, where he developed into an all-star under the tutelage of defensive-minded coach Tom Thibodeau. But eventually, Thibodeau got fired and Fred Hoiberg took the reins as the Bulls head coach. Hoiberg and Butler clashed because Hoiberg had a laid-back, player-friendly approach to coaching, while Butler thought that he wasn't demanding enough of his teammates. Eventually, Butler demanded a trade and the Bulls decided to go into a rebuild. With 2 years remaining on his contract, Butler was traded to the Minnesota Timberwolves in exchange for a young Zach LaVine, Chris Dunn, and a first-round pick that they ended up using to select Lauri Markkanen. The fit in Minnesota looked very encouraging at first glance. They had 2 young first overall picks in the roster in Andrew Wiggins and Karl-Anthony Towns. On top of that, they had Butler's longtime head coach Tom Thibodeau as the head coach. Thibodeau was expected to turn the Wolves roster into a competitive Western Conference team, much like he did with Chicago in the East. He'd already coached Rose into the league MVP and was now trying to do the same with Karl-Anthony Towns. Jimmy Butler was supposed to be the veteran star, a leader that could help guide Minnesota in the direction that it needed to go. Unfortunately, Butler's personality completely clashed with Karl-Anthony Towns. Towns was a top prospect ever since his high school days. He had incredible skills for a 7-footer, which sort of enabled him to cruise his way into the NBA. In high school, college coaches around the country were begging him to join their program. He decided to commit to John Calipari and the Kentucky Wildcats, where he only played 1 season. Following his year in Kentucky, he got drafted first overall by the Minnesota Timberwolves. Life sort of came easy to Towns up to that point. He hadn't yet got rid of some of his bad habits as he adapted to the NBA. Towns still lacked discipline in his work ethic and was overweight. He was a nice kid, but no one could say he was tough at that point in his career. Jimmy Butler was the opposite. He was kicked out of his mother's home at age 13 and left to fend for himself. He wasn't recruited by any major programs out of high school, so he was forced to spend 1 year at Tyler Junior College in Texas. Following his 1 year at JUCO, he was offered a scholarship by Marquette, where he worked like a dog to earn a starting role and eventually got drafted to the NBA, where he had to battle every day to earn his keep. Butler believed that the Timberwolves were being too easy on Cat, but the organization prioritized his development and comfort during the early stages of his career. The last thing they needed was for Towns to demand a trade out of town like other highly touted stars have done in the past. But Jimmy Butler couldn't give a damn about that sort of stuff. He wanted to win, and Karl-Anthony Towns' relaxed approach didn't jive with him. During a flight to New Orleans in November, Butler yelled at his team on a flight, demanding harder work, particularly on the defensive end of the floor. Late in the season, Butler got injured and the team went 8-9, which forced them on the outside of a playoff spot. However, Jimmy returned for the last 3 games of the season, in which the team went 3-0. The last game was an overtime thriller in which Jimmy willed his team over the Denver Nuggets in overtime to earn the final playoff spot on the last day of the regular season. It was crystal clear that the Wolves were a far better team with Jimmy Butler in the lineup, but his demanding personality didn't mesh with the rest of the group. The Timberwolves played the Houston Rockets in round 1 and went down 3-1 in the series. In between games 4 and 5, Butler was frustrated. He told reporters he called out his teammates, claiming that he works harder than them and he can't relate to some of the players who don't want to win as badly as he does. In the final game of the series, the Rockets crushed the Wolves. Following the game, Jimmy didn't fly back to Minnesota with his teammates. Instead, he bought his own flight back to Los Angeles by himself and refused to participate in team medical exams that all players go through as part of their exit interviews. Early in the offseason, Butler told the Wolves that he was unhappy with the way the roster was structured and that if changes weren't made, he wouldn't want to come back. He also requested that the team adjust their cap situation in a way that would enable them to offer him a larger contract under CBA rules. But the Wolves management basically ignored his request, hoping things would blow over by training camp. They did not. Butler called Thibodeau and told him he wanted the Wolves to trade him. Once again, the Wolves seemed to balk at the request and stayed silent. When training camp began, the whole team showed up, except for Jimmy Butler. Then, on October 10th, 1 week before the season, Jimmy Butler showed up to one of the most famous practices in NBA history. He showed up quiet, not conversing with anyone. While players were making conversation and shooting around, Jimmy was stretching by himself. Eventually, Thibodeau gathered the team and told them to run a scrimmage. He wanted the starters, Jimmy Butler, Karl-Anthony Towns, Andrew Wiggins, Jeff Teague, and Taj Gibson to play on one team. But Jimmy interrupted. He said, "I'm not playing with those guys. I'm playing with these guys." Jimmy grabbed a bunch of G-leaguers and bench warmers who were unlikely to get any minutes with the team. Thibodeau agreed and threw Derrick Rose in with the starters and allowed Jimmy to play with the team's spares. Right off the jump, Jimmy yelled, "I've got Cat." As soon as Towns got the ball, Butler stripped him of it and took it down the court for a basket. Jimmy yelled, "Get the F out of here, he's trash." On the next possession, Towns scored the ball and started taunting back. "He's too small, he can't guard me." But Jimmy Butler was not going to go down without dominating. He made it his mission not just to beat, but to embarrass the starters. He led his group on a 10-0 run while yelling at the GM, "Pay me, pay me." When the game was finished, Jimmy and the G-Leaguers won 18-6. Then he ripped off his warm-up uniform and showed he was wearing a Wolves jersey and Wolves shorts, but with the Minnesota logo cut out of them, showing off his bare chest and thigh. He continued screaming at the GM, "You guys think you can win without me? I just beat your starters with a bunch of G-Leaguers. You effing need me. You can't win without me. Pay me, pay me." Then he ran out of the practice facility and was at home before anyone could talk to him or get a rematch. When he got home, he met journalist Rachel Nichols at his house for an interview an hour after practice in which he told her exactly what just happened. Meanwhile, his Wolves teammates were left watching the interview together at the practice facility. The incident caused enough friction in the locker room to force management to trade him. 10 games into the season, the Wolves traded Butler for an underwhelming package including Robert Covington, Dario Saric, Jared Bayless, and second-round picks to the Philadelphia 76ers. The incident severely tarnished Jimmy Butler's perception around the league until he got to Miami. But in retrospect, it's just an epic story about the same Jimmy Butler that we've grown to love.
That's my boy.